So I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Paul Gibbons. Paul is a multi-best-selling author on Amazon. He's a former investment banker, CEO, professor, and a leadership consultant, and now a scholar, a keynote speaker. And Paul comes to us with an amazing wealth of knowledge on leadership, culture, and what drives business. So welcome, Paul. It's such a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. And that sounds like a lot of careers. My father says, just as you get good at something, you decide to do something else. So bless you, Dad. Anyway,
it's called growing.
Well, it's called being a wanderer, peripatetic, or a short attention span. I often wish I was the kind of person that dug in at the age of 18 to, I don't really wish this, but because silly thing to wish, dug in at the age of 18 and plowed a very deep, narrow furrow for my whole life and accomplished great things for the world and humanity as a result. But anyway, I've done what I've done.
Yeah. I think you've done a lot with the influencing on business culture and change through your books and the work that you have done. So just in the books that you've written, you mention a lot about leadership and the inner works of leadership. What do you mean by that when you're talking about the inner works?
Well, yeah, leadership's, I'm not the only one who said this, not by perhaps a long, long way. But leadership is an inside job. The challenge most people who want to grow leaders feel is getting in touch with themselves, their sense of purpose, their values, getting to know their emotional, psychological weaknesses and triggers. In my case, my great flaw was a certain amount of impulsivity as a leader, which can be useful because you do move very fast, much faster. My ex-wife used to say, as soon as you have an idea, you've done it before anybody else can comment, which is an asset, and it's also a tremendous liability. And so, getting to know, doing the inner work, which is getting to know yourself as a human being, being compassionate with the bits that, you need to be compassionate, but also, giving yourself a kick in the backside and saying, this is something I got to work about if I want to do it. And I think that's partly the inner work. The inner work relates to the outer work in the sense that people don't follow people who say, hey, you're going to make me a lot of money if we do these things. You're like, sure. Nobody gets out of bed for that. But someone I have mixed views on, like Elon Musk, is like, I want to change the world. I want us to be a multi-planet species. I mean, that by itself is a very strong statement. Greta Thunberg, we need to be climate neutral. The people who, is one of the things, I have a book called The Spirituality of Work and Leadership. And one of the things that these people who make these bold, transcendent, visionary, purposeful claims, Greta Thunberg, Elon Musk is certainly one, Gandhi was certainly another. I want the people of my country to be free. Martin Luther King was another who made a stand, and they didn't have, none of these people I've mentioned had the obvious resources. Like Gandhi was not a wealthy man, he wasn't a powerful man, didn't have a lot of political power when he began this journey. But the power of his stand, the power of his commitment was inspirational to people. Like, I get out of bed and I can follow this guy. And the same with King, and the same with Greta Thunberg. And sadly, also sometimes the same with people who are less admired in history. I mean, Hitler was an incredibly effective leader, and also one of the most despotic and, the iconic, like, you have to name one evil guy in the century, he would be the top of most people's lists. I mean, there are plenty of candidates. Stalin's a candidate, Pol Pot's a candidate, but we have candidates. But Hitler's definitely on everybody's top three. But yet, he was a poor corporal and a failed artist, and he was from Austria, and he didn't have Aryan looks, even though he espoused Aryan looks. He was dark-haired and Levantine in his look. And yet, he managed to, through the power of his vision, albeit a horrific vision, but he had a vision of a 1,000-year Reich, which inspired German people. And, of course, Donald Trump in our own country took a leaf from his playbook. And it's the kind of thing, America first, we're the greatest country that's ever been, the greatest country there ever will be. And, we can get back to our former glory, which is very much a Hitlerian message. If we just, get rid of these brown people that are making us, destroying our country. It's not quite what he says, but, it implies that in a lot of his work. Anyway, that's
so
fine.
the leadership then you're sort of talking about is that clarity of vision and that conviction. And how do we then, so if you've got a group of leaders, if you're looking at a senior management team in an organization, or even just a couple if you're looking at a medium-sized one, if you've got a disparate vision, how do we work with that team? Because you've got to get the leadership team right first before you can put a vision out to your people. So how do you work on that inner works to get a bit better alignment before you go out to the rest of the organization? Because if your organization sees a friction between the leaders, there's definitely not going to be a cohesive business.
Yeah. So there's the inner alignment, right? The integrity of my mind and purpose, my words, which are the main tool of a leader, is what they say. We communicate is one of their things. And body, action, the election of mind, word, and body. You could call it integrity if you want. And that also applies at the team level. And, even in organizations where there's enormous amount of trust and admiration for the leader at the top, there will be a collection of people around the table who have different versions of the same thing, or perhaps alternate versions. And as you say, super accurately, it doesn't do for them to try and lead an organ. I mean, we can respect their differences and we don't suppress their differences, but the team need to deal with those differences themselves. Otherwise, there may reign chaos. And we've all seen that. You've seen that as an advisor to leaders as well. If there's a lack of alignment in mind, word, and deed action at the team level, that can be incredibly damaging to an organization. People don't know which way to turn. So I agree with you. You sort of answered your own question.
Yeah. So how do we support that inner work on our leadership to help us align? I guess that's where I was trying to go. So how do we support our leaders to work on themselves and to come up to the realization? Because there's some people that are just not that self-aware.
Oh, well, that's my job.
Yeah.
That's my job. You can't change what you're unaware of, right?
Yeah.
So that's partly our job. One program I ran, almost every program I ran had a module on getting people to talk, I'm going to use this word in quotes, more really to one another, more authentically, more vulnerably to one another, to inside this safe container that we've created here. Let's drop the masks and the bullshit a day and talk to each other as human beings who do some things well and some things not well, and also give them the skills to be able to give each other feedback in a way they almost certainly never have before. And I also think of leaders as, so some people don't know how to, sometimes when you do this, people have these kind of vague, nondescript assessments of their fellow team members, like he's a good chap. Or she's good, or, you ask them and they don't have anything granular and specific and developmental to say. It's as if I look at a championship golfer, right? And their swings all look the same to me.
Yeah.
And I would be entirely useless as a coach to those people. So one of the faculties that a leader needs to develop is being able to observe other leaders and observe their strengths and weaknesses and speak to them about them. And if everybody on the team can do that, becomes an observer, of leadership behavior, leadership effectiveness, leadership alignment, and all that kind of stuff, then we can have some really important conversations as a team together, help each other to grow and develop. And that's the goal. The goal is not to have a consultant attached to your backside for the rest of your career. It's to become self-supporting as a team and able to support the development of the potential of every leader in the room together. And that starts at the top, because if the top guy is bulletproof and covered in Teflon and never made a mistake in his life and all that kind of stuff, well, just conversations will never happen. So, but usually by the time someone like that comes to me, they're already aware, like, things aren't going the way I want them to go. and how do I fix my team? And I say, well, we could fix your team, but let's talk about you right now.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what's going on with you and all that. So, yeah.
The work really has to start with self first, then so that absolute self-awareness, encouraging those open conversations. And I guess it's a trust factor as well. And sometimes you've got dysfunctional teams that don't really trust each other. And
a lot.
yeah. And I guess you did leadership consultancy for a long time. Can you tell us about perhaps some of the businesses and examples of businesses that you've gone into where they were totally dysfunctional,
Sure.
and some of the tools you may have used to move them into being a much more high performing functional team, where the organizations went from surviving to thriving?
I think some organizations take leadership development very seriously and some don't. And I have really only worked, this is a blessing or a curse, with like companies in the top 50 or top 25 companies in the world, whatever, right? I mean, there's pluses and minuses to all that. So Shell and British Petroleum and Barclays Bank and HSBC Bank and, a bit of Microsoft and a bit of Google thrown in there. So I've worked for very big and excellent companies. And all of those companies have one thing in common. They all take their leadership development very, very seriously internally. I mean, they don't mess around. They know the importance of this. Now, they don't always attack it in the right way. So what have I done? So, I mean, I gave an example of a professional services firm, an investment bank, and they had a very backslappy culture, good old boy, English good old boy culture. I think we'll all be familiar with that. And they were very backslappy and pally and jovial with themselves in public, and they can be absolutely toxic in private. So none of the useful feedback they had for their colleagues found its way to their colleagues' ears. So they're doing the opposite of what is right. Is not having the courage or the skills to talk frankly to people about how they could do better. And then creating a toxic culture by talking behind their back. Yeah, because that's the worst thing you can do. I mean, I joined IBM a year and a half, 2 years ago, and I was shocked at how people sometimes spoke about their colleagues. Absolutely blown away. And where it was my gift, I said, it was in Stephen Covey's book that I discovered it. It was a revelation to me. It's never say anything about someone that you wouldn't say to them. And it's such a trivially sounding idea, but it's almost foundational for a healthy culture that you never say anything about someone that you wouldn't say to them. Have the courage, to use a gendered phrase I shouldn't use, man up, and have a conversation if you have something to say. I know it takes courage, and I know these conversations aren't pleasant, and I know they're triggering for both sides. Have the conversation, and certainly if you're still unable to have the conversation, maybe the power dynamics don't serve you. That's too much. I don't want to use that excuse too much, but maybe the power dynamics are all wrong. But even if you can't have the conversation, then, but God knows, don't say it to anybody else in the organization, like at least have the integrity to button up if you don't have the courage to have the conversation with the person, I think.
So it's really that values push, that you've got to be very clear on your organizational values that we are wanting for your senior leadership to demonstrate, because without that you can't change or influence the culture or where the business, how the atmosphere of the business at all.
Well, yeah, it's a talk. I mean, if you go take my example further, it's a very toxic place because people will imitate those behaviors, cascade that sort of culture down. And so the leadership development work I did for this firm, if it had one signature result, was that we didn't do this anymore. They became much more skillful and courageous about talking to one another about matters that may be hard to talk about. And they became much more buttoned up when it comes to criticizing leaders who weren't, if you will, in the room. Like they stamped that out of their culture. And that was a long process. And then I also worked with them on their personal vision. So, I mean, you know, how do you do that? There's a million different ways, right? Money that we're borrowing from the new age psychology, popular psychology world. We've done vision boards. You know, it's easy to make fun of vision boards, but, you know, they have their uses, you know, pulling out pictures and, you know, making collages of images that are useful too. The brain thinks about things in a different way when it has to think about things pictorially. Having people draw their leadership journey on a timeline, lessons learned, abject failures, greatest successes, learning points. How has this shaped who I am as a person now, as a leader? Having them articulate that story uncovers some knowledge, helps uncover some knowledge that may have been hidden from them. Like, wow, look at this. I always been committed to this kind of thing. That's interesting, even since I was a little kid. Like one of the things that inspired me was that. And then also sharing it with other people creates a sense of trust and intimacy. Like we've all had lives and we've all had skinned knees when we were children, and we've all been, you know, kicked off the football team when we were in high school, or some, you know, some horrifying, you know, we've all maybe, you know, something like 80% of people have been fired from a job or something like that by the time you get to 50. Some huge number. I can't remember. Yeah. I looked it up once, right? That's a huge number. We all had that. So, you know, those, you either learn from those experiences or you discard them. And we encourage people to learn from them. So, I mean, I'm speaking converted here. Perhaps your audience is already converted. We know that. This is something that we know. We need to take those painful lessons and extract the nectar of learning from them.
Yeah, I think like leadership feeds directly into culture, and we have lots of discussions around culture and culture change. And there is some people that are actively aware of what their culture is, and there's some organizations that have no real idea of what their culture is. And often people talk about, I've tried to change my culture, but it didn't work. So what are some of the things that lead to perhaps a failed attempt at culture change versus a successful transition and culture change and achieving what we want in our business?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, yeah, I mean, I think by necessity, people are blind to the culture of the organization. Once you've been there in a long time, there'll always be a sense of blindness. They say a fish can't see water, right? That's the example. And that's one of the great benefits of travel as a human being. I'm talking about the human journey now, is things that you take for granted about where you live and how you live and your cultural norms and values. All of a sudden you pitch up someplace and you see something different, you learn something about yourself. It's like, wow, that's kind of unique. It happened to me in France, actually. I'm a French speaker as well as an English speaker, but I had never worked in France as an adult, so I went to France to work. And the French are horrifically, in those days anyway, in the 90s, late for meetings. And I was happy. I was dating a woman. I eventually married her, who was a diversity consultant at the time. And I used to come home and say, these sons of bitches, we're there at 5 o'clock for the 5 o'clock meeting. And these guys are rocking up at 5:20 and 5:25. And then once they rock up, they take 5 minutes to get a cup of coffee and 5 minutes to shake everyone's hand in the room. We're starting these meetings 30, 35 minutes late. And she says, well, you have a very Northern European view of time. And I said, well, that's efficient. I mean, this is like inefficient. And she said, well, efficiency is a very Northern European value. You know, so it was revealed to me, something that was hidden from me, that my relationship for example, it's a trivial example, with punctuality was very Northern European and driven by a set of Northern Europeans, and there were other values. What did these French people value? They valued a certain ease in life and a less hurriesome value of life and social connections and it's stuff that maybe I don't want to adopt, but then I could at least see the cultural sense in it. And that was a cultural awakening for me. And that's how people have cultural awakening. So when I joined IBM a couple of years ago, or something like that, I was a very good observer of their culture because I was an outsider and I could see, wow, they do what?
Yeah.
And that's a great value. And so that culture change consultant, in a sense, can provide a lot of value. Now, it's better if people self-diagnose because culture is not really something you can come in sort of expert mode and go, oh, here's your culture. And by the way, it sucks. You need to be able to speak their language and have them sort of, how do you begin to have them become aware of these cultural things that they take for granted, that they think this is the word the world is, people do X. It's a dog-eat-dog world or whatever, narrative they may have about their culture. Help them shine a light on that so that they can self-diagnose and then relate that to business problems. Like, okay, you're having troubles getting customers. I wonder why that is. Yeah, let's talk about what's the culture around here? Oh, you compete with one another for sales. Oh, that's interesting. I wonder if that's the most efficient way. You have an internal sort of competitive, sharp-elbowed, pointy-elbowed culture. Okay, does that help sales or hurt them? Okay, it hurts them. Okay, well, what can we do about that? That sort of conversation.
Yeah. So how does culture then, like if you're not aware and we become aware, how do we actively then put things in place to move perhaps a culture from one that's a bit toxic or one where we're leading to high staff turnovers or lack of staff engagement into one where the culture is such that it embraces the whole team rather than divides the team and silos the team and leads us to a space where we can improve our productivity. And ultimately, if you've got the right culture, you improve productivity and profit, which is what we're in business for.
Indeed. I mean, changing a toxic culture is incredibly difficult because the people who are the keepers of the toxic culture in the organization often have a lot of power. Often, always have a lot of power. The leaders are modeling that behavior. They're transmitters of that behavior in the organization. And in order to change culture, you need a certain amount of trust. You need to be able to talk about it. Toxic culture, you won't have that. So actually, it's kind of a difficult thing to change. But let's more thing. One of the mistakes people make in changing culture is they first of all make a list of values and think that that's culture. And I don't want to denigrate values work. God, I've done a ton of it. Help people articulate what their values are, but they all sound kind of the same. Like if you look at IBM's values next to Hewlett-Packard's values, next to Barclays Bank's values, next to Microsoft values, you don't go, oh, wow, that's radically different. They all say the same kind of words. And what's also common is that they do a very poor job of translating those abstract words into behaviors. So integrity, what does that mean? Yeah. How are we behaving? How are we behaving to customers? How are we behaving towards one another? Yeah. What does that mean? What does integrity mean to us? This thing. And getting that down to behavioral terms is critical because unless you cascade those values down and have specific behavioral norms and standards and agreements, you're kind of wasting your breath. I mean, you say these inspirational words, but whatever, IBM, Enron's values, I can't remember exactly what they were. They're in one of my books, but Enron's values were integrity, trust, service, whatever. And it was a mess of internal toxicity and lawlessness, shall we say. So value statements don't mean much. So that's the first mistake people make is they focus on these value statements. And it's not that they're a bad thing by themselves, but they're completely insufficient. And if you have a value statement in a company without aligning the organization with those values, they just become a sense of ridicule. It's just like, oh, those things. Sure. You get ridicule from the staff. Plenty, right? as you know, as you've seen, they go, oh yeah, integrity, right? That's one of our values. Oh yeah, okay, yeah. I'll let you know when I see some. Yeah.
So it's about translating whatever, if you are got a value set and you're saying this is what I want to be, or this is where we want to be, it's
Yeah.
about translating that into behavior, and it's a consistent behavior. It's not I'm going to behave this way one day and I'm going to change the
Yeah.
whole culture. It's
Yeah.
living and breathing. So
Yeah.
how do we take that? Sometimes, you'll get some people that get on the boat and row in the same direction, or swim against the tide. How do we as leaders deal with those people who constantly swim against the tide and don't want to come on board perhaps with the change in
Well,
culture?
they can be super useful because they combat, one of the things in organizations that's unhelpful, which is groupthink. And so these people who are sometimes very annoying, pointing in a different direction. So they're sort of a gift in a way, and then also they can be completely toxic and completely just ruin the team dynamic. And there was a person like this at one of these firms I ran a big program for, who was just he was too effective commercially to fire. But we were trying to do some culture change, and he was just like, screw you. This is, I'm not going there. And eventually they did fire him. Jack Welch, who I don't admire, but one of the things he said that was thing is the person is toughest to get rid of and who's also the most toxic in the organization is the person who's sort of making their numbers commercially, but not living the values. They're very hard to get. He says, someone is not making their numbers and not living the values, just get rid of them, whatever, right?
Yeah.
And if someone is living the values and are making the numbers, then you promote them and use them as examples to the organization. And then there'll be people who are living the values who aren't producing their numbers. He says, well, you need to do something else with them. You need to work on whatever it is, whatever that deficit might be skills, might be whatever, right? And then there's the person who's making their numbers, who's not living the values. He says they're the hardest ones to deal with because, in one sense, they're effective at their job, but in another sense, they're very damaging to the organization. And the fact that they're effective is actually a liability, because they're modeling something for other people in the organization, is just like you can do what you like as long as you're making your numbers. Like you don't want that modeled. Yeah. And that's kind of what happened at Wells Fargo in the United States. I mean, I've done a lot of work in business ethics. I was professor of business ethics, like briefly, like a few years, 2 or 3 years, and really enjoyed that time because I got to dive into the great ethical scandals of the 21st century. Yes. We had Wells Fargo, we've had Enron, we've had the Deepwater Horizon explosion that cost $1 trillion worth of damage in the Gulf of Mexico and the United States. So I don't have any examples from New Zealand. You guys seem to behave yourself.
I don't know. Perhaps we're just too small down here in New Zealand for it to influence the rest of the world. So yeah.
I've done something really radical recently that I've read in New Zealand. It's something to do with green energy. And it's something to do with being coal-free by 2035 or 2040. Yeah. That's a new policy. Yeah, you're going to be coal-free. And you're the first country in the world, I think, to say we're going to be coal-free. It'll take a little while, 10, 15, 20 years, and we'll look after our coal miners and,
Yeah, it's renewable, all about renewable energy. So a lot of here in New Zealand, it's geothermal and hydro and wind.
You're a world leader in a lot of things for a little country. You guys are a world leader in a lot of things. Yeah. There's a lot to admire about that. You're tucked away in the middle. I doubt anybody in my hemisphere has gone to New Zealand. Not many, but
yeah. So, Paul, what would be 1 or 2 key takeaways for our audience today if they were looking at how to start looking at their leadership and how to start their culture change journey to achieve what they want to be, where they want to be?
How do you get that mirror held up to you? That's the question for a leader, right? Where do I find it? Where do I find a good mirror? And we want a mirror that doesn't like reflect back to me my self-concept, like narcissists, right? And that's the problem with a lot of self-report questionnaires, is that they just feed back to you what you already think about yourself. It's not very useful. Not very useful. People feed back to Paul what Paul already thinks about Paul, right? We need, so 360 is one answer as well. I'm not a great fan of questionnaires and psychometrics and stuff like that. I have a book called Change Myths which has a chapter on psychometrics and why many of them are a load of rubbish. And why MBTI, the one that we've all done, is kind of a load of rubbish. It's worth a read. It's actually kind of funny. So that's the thing, was how do we find a good mirror? And then eventually, you know, what you really want is them to be their own mirror, them to be self-aware enough so that they don't need an external help to hold a mirror up to one another. And it's the same thing, to hold a mirror up to their culture. Like, how do you get people to see the parts of their culture that aren't working? And so that's our service as outsiders, as consultant, as expert. You know, we are, as leadership consultants, the people who can observe the golf swing.
Yeah.
We can see leaders, and we've been looking at and coached enough leaders and developed enough leaders where we can say, they don't do that, do they? And they do this, and that's not really helpful. And so we're like the person who's able to coach, like all great professionals in the world, you know, Tiger Woods and great poker players and great chess players and great athletes all have a coach. Everybody has a coach. Everybody is. If you want to be good at your job, you have to have a coach. And we don't really have that. I mean, IBM, nobody did. I was absolutely blown away when I joined IBM. Nobody has a coach. All these people running billion-dollar businesses. Not that they were all ineffective, but they certainly all could have been better in some ways or another, right? We all can be. And they're running $1 billion business. So the commercials are, if we can make this person running $1 billion business a little bit more effective, then, oh, wow, we've done it. You know, there's commercial justification as well. So, and then there are companies that I've worked for where everybody who's senior has a coach. You know, they may not see him once a week, right? But they'll have someone they talk to once a month who's on contract with them to have that. I have a coach. I have a coach. I talk to him every week for 45 minutes. And he tells me stuff I don't want to hear.
And I think that's what the importance of having, finding that person that you can sound off, and it's just really forces you to think a little bit more laterally about how you're coming over, or how even talking through a situation where you've reacted to something and why. And it's just unpicking things in a safe environment and a trusted environment. So I would also encourage people to get a coach and to help that through. But culture change is just such a vital, or culture of an organization and leadership in organization is such a vital part of any business success. And we've had the last few years of COVID and surviving, especially our small, medium-sized businesses. And it's about taking that step now, stop just inward focus on cost and survival, and it's how are we going to thrive in the future, because the aim of our business, we've got to make money to stay alive, and it's not fun just surviving. You know, we want to be actually out there thriving and enjoying what we're doing in our businesses. We do.
Wouldn't that be nice? From surviving to thriving. Thrivability. I have a friend, there's a thrivability movement, not sustainability, thrivability, whatever. Okay. I don't know. It's a good concept. Like we want to get past survival mode and you know, I worked in organizations in the 80s, even in the 70s, actually. I actually had a job in the 70s, but I certainly was fully employed in the 80s and the 90s. We have come a long way. Things are much better. I mean, their leadership mantra, I mean, people in the 80s used to say things like, you need to kick ass sometimes. Kick ass meant being a bully, raising your voice, threatening people, things that would be considered completely out of line. Not that they never happened today, but they would be considered out of line today. People who behave like that in leadership positions. I actually heard someone who's worked for, there's a guy who there's a failing department store in the United States called Sears. Did they ever have Sears in New Zealand?
No, but no, we know about it.
These massive big box stores, right? Yeah. And in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s, it was where Americans went to buy everything. The most trusted big retailer, kind of like Marks and Spencer's in England, but bigger. And they've collapsed through a series of mismanagement. And I've heard that the guy who's running that, who's this billionaire guy, spends his entire time like shouting at people. He doesn't listen to a word his team says, and he just yells at people the whole time. And you know what? It's going to be very hard to change. Like, why should he change? Like, the guy's $1 billion, you know, billionaire. Like, what's in it for him? He's like, screw you guys. But he's ruining, one of the most iconic American brands that perhaps that's ever existed, like a brand that is associated with the 20th century American consumer culture, good or bad. It's associated with the consumer culture. Anyway, I heard, so there is still stuff like that around. But we've come a long, long, long ways. Like these conversations that you and I have about meaning and purpose, right? Yeah. They would be considered really fruity in the 1980s. Really like, dude, just pick up your paycheck and go home. Like,
but that's sort of what we're trying to change,
Yeah, that's right. And it's like a purpose without a paycheck, right? It's like paycheck without a purpose. It's like, I wasn't the first person to say that, but people there are limits to what people will do for a paycheck, but purpose is really inspiring thing. I want to show you guys a book, actually. I wrote a book. It's not on the bestseller list. But this is a book that come through there.
Yeah, spirituality of work.
Yeah, and even those I know New Zealand's a very secular country, so people think spirituality and think religion. In some countries, it's more kind of spirituality we've been talking about a little bit in this call, connecting with a sense of purpose, connecting with a sense of getting meaning from work. Helping others find meaning in their work and helping others find purpose in their work. And also ethics is a critical part of that. Like what's the right way to proceed. So there's some good stuff. There's some good stuff in there. And my other brand new book is Change Myths. So I don't want to miss a chance to plug my new book, which looks at things that some of the things in the world that are in the change management world that are rubbish.
We're just about coming to the end of our thing. Where can people perhaps find all your books? Because there's some amazing reads on change management. I know your first book is one of the #1 bestsellers on Amazon, and a very influential book in change, business change.
Really, I got lucky with my first book. It did really well.
The Science of Organizational Change. Yeah. So on Amazon, your books are available. Is there just some parting thoughts we finish our interview, other than it's been fantastic chat and we've had some very insightful thoughts around leadership and culture?
I hope they're valuable to you. I know I'm speaking to you. I'm preaching to the converted to some extent. These are things you probably agreed with some of what I said, 75% perhaps. But you can find me at paulgibbons.net, and twice a year I send out a newsletter saying, hey, here's a new book, or here's something interesting you don't think about. I don't spam people with. I spend the first 10 minutes of my day deleting 200 or 300 emails that I've received that I don't want to read. That's the world that we live in. So Paul Gibbons, please connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd welcome any connections on LinkedIn and any conversations that follow from that. Grab a copy of Change Myths or Science of Organizational Change, or if you fancy spirituality of work and leadership, grab a copy of that. I hope I get to meet your New Zealand one day.
I'll drop a link of your LinkedIn link on the email that we send out to all the participants, so they can reach out to you for your newsletter. So that would be really fantastic. And I want to thank you for a very insightful chat. Leadership is key, clear vision, much more important than behavior, and being consistent about what we want to model for our people. So that's really fantastic.
Thank you for having me. Really, thank you for having me. Wonderful. Let's exchange.